Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I would like to introduce a very important scholar, uh, that is Dr. Rahe. It's an absolute honor to welcome him to our discussion today. He's an esteemed historian and political philosopher, widely recognized for his groundbreaking work in exploring the connections between classical republicanism and modern democratic governance. He is the author of numerous influential books, including Republics, Ancient and Modern, Classical Republicanism and the American Revolution, which has reshaped how we understand the enduring relevance of ancient political thought. Dr. Rahe is a dedicated scholar whose insights into classical education and civic virtue continue to inspire educators and students alike. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. So you also, I didn't mention in this thing here in the intro that you have a PhD with ancient Greek history. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah, at Yale.
right.
And just so everyone knows, I'm going to be putting his website up there, and he has just, I couldn't even count so many books. He's very prolific. So, but I want to take a moment here and let the families know why we are going to incorporate Republic's ancient and modern classical republicanism and American Revolution into our curriculum. And I think it's very important that we know that. So we want to bridge ancient and modern philosophy to a point here. It connects the classical republicanism with modern democratic principles, providing students with a historical framework for understanding civic responsibility. And as I had mentioned many times on my website and on other leaderships, that my school isn't just about coming up with graduates. We're going into a society. So what does that mean to be a citizen, a good citizen? Civic Virtue and Leadership. The book emphasizes the importance of civic virtue and active citizenship, aligning with Pax Academia's mission to cultivate future leaders. Critical Thinking. Its analysis of ancient and modern republics challenge students to think critically about governance, power, and community. The reason, obviously the critical thinking part is important, but one of the things I wanted to bring up with that is we tend to throw words around so many times, like a republic, democracy, words like that, liberty. It gets thrown around so many times that we don't reflect on what it really means. And I think with this book, it really brings that out, helps us to stand back and actually understand why we say the Pledge of Allegiance rather than just reciting words every time. Moral and intellectual development, the exploration of virtue, ethics, and Republican ideals fosters moral character and intellectual growth in young learners. Again, it's not just about intellectual development at our school. We want to have students understand what is a moral character? What does that mean to be a moral person, especially when we go out in our society with all the temptations and distractions that we have with social media and so forth. Okay, and then relevance to contemporary issues. The book themes prepare students to engage thoughtfully with today's political and social challenges through a classical lens. A lot of classical literature back in ancient Greek. Well, this is 2024. So how does that relate today? Okay, so it's very important to go over those things. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started? Okay, so Professor, how do the classical Republican ideals discussed in your book, Republic, Ancient and Modern, inform the concept of civic virtue in a modern educational setting?
It's complicated because we live in a largely commercial world.
Yeah, yeah.
There's been a tremendous shift. It becomes visible in the 17th century. It's probably going on before that, but it becomes highly visible in the 17th century. It becomes dominant in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it continues today. And connected with that commerce is scientific progress and a kind of technological revolution. To give you a sense of the difference, Aristotle says man is by nature a political animal. And what makes him a political animal is he possesses logos, the capacity for rational speech. which is articulated in deliberation within a political community concerning what is advantageous, what is just, and what is good. We're familiar with that. I mean, we have debates about what is advantageous, what is just, and what is good.
Right.
Benjamin Franklin, in conversation in England with Dr. Johnson, said, according to Boswell anyway, man is by nature a tool-making animal. There's a huge difference between being a political animal and a tool-making animal. A tool-making animal, if that's the basic things that distinguishes human beings from other animals, is a budding technologist.
Mm.
That is to say, tools are used by artisans.
Right.
In techne, what the Greeks call techne, the arts, but they don't mean by the arts the painting and sculpture. They mean what artisans do. And it's the application of logos, rational thought to that. And you can see the importance of that in the American Constitution. We have a constitutional right that is enshrined in the patent clause. It's not a natural right. It's a constitutional right to a monopoly over the profits from a discovery. That's an unusual thing, and it originates in a practice under Queen Elizabeth. It was defended in the British Parliament by Sir Francis Bacon, who was the great prophet of the scientific revolution. So there's a sense in which the modern republic is committed to the scientific revolution from the beginning. In other words, we have a new kind of property, a property in ideas, and those ideas have to do with the sorts of things that artisans do, which is fabricate machines or make use of machines for any number of purposes. And of course, if you look at the history of this country since the colonial period, but also especially since 1776, it has been a technologically dynamic country.
Right.
And of course, with that technology goes commerce, because you produce items that people never knew they needed. For example, podcasts.
Yeah.
It's or cell phones. You know, I grew up in a world without cell phones. The closest we had was Dick Tracy cartoons with him. And by the way, there are now watches that are cell phones. So really, it's right out of Dick Tracy. So the thing was imagined, but it didn't exist. When I went off to college, I took a typewriter. I still have it up in my attic. I brought it down once upon a time to show my children
I haven't seen one
what
of
a
those.
typewriter is, because they didn't know.
Right.
So, I mean,
that and a rotary phone, right?
yes, right. So, so there is a shift, and there are two other differences between classical antiquity and the present day. The first is the Christian religion. And probably you could say Islam too. Universal religions that are monotheistic in character, that aren't tied up with any particular political community. In fact, in the case of Christianity, there's no direct connection between the faith and a community and a political community at all. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's.
Mhm.
That's very different. And in the case of Islam, which is a religion of holy law, there is a kind of political dimension to it. And there is an imagination of all Muslims belonging to the same ummah, the same nation. But still, the connection between, especially in the West, between faith and political community is not strong. Whereas in antiquity, every Greek city, every other ancient city in Sumeria and Babylonia and Akkad, had its own gods.
Right.
So there's a wonderful book by a man named Fustel de Coulanges called The Ancient City, and its focus is on civic religion. And civic religion is particular, which means to leave your city is not just to leave a political community, it's to leave a religious community. It's to abandon your gods. To commit treason is also to commit a crime against the gods. And if you commit a crime against the gods, it may bring them down on your city. So that too is a form of treason. And say in Athens, there's a single law that covers what look to us to be different crimes or different faults. Christianity, suddenly you've got what is in principle a world religion, and you have political particularity. And that alters things.
Right.
It alters things in another way. For the Christian, this is only a pilgrimage here on earth. And our true fatherland is in the afterlife, which means the connection, the total loyalty to the political community that you see in ancient Sparta, ancient Athens, ancient Rome, that's not a possibility within the Christian world.
Right.
The third thing that's altering, the first is tool making animal, the second is Christianity. The third is Christianity produced a kind of civil war within Christendom over and over again. Over doctrinal issues having to do with Christology, there were battles between Christians in late antiquity.
Hmm.
That led to the Muslim conquest of Egypt, where the Christians of Egypt, who had been persecuted by the Orthodox Christians of Constantinople, welcomed the Muslim invaders. Similarly, you have the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And in reaction to that, there was a rethinking of politics that you find in figures like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and David Hume and Adam Smith and Montesquieu, and an attempt to found a new species of government, a limited government, which existed for the sake of protecting life, liberty, and property, but had no business meddling in questions of religious faith or religious observance.
So,
So there are these huge differences, and what that means is with Locke and with Montesquieu, you get a shift away from putting the perfection of human character and the propagation of the Christian faith. Either one of those is secondary, and the government's main focus is on national defense, enforcement of contracts, protection of people against criminals domestically. In other words, a government that isn't especially high-minded. I mean, it's high-minded in the sense of it protects these rights, but it's not high-minded in the sense that it is aiming at the perfection of character.
Okay.
So there's profound differences, and yet you cannot defend a liberal society, a liberal commercial society. You cannot make it function properly unless people are honest, and unless people at certain times are courageous. So something like the ancient virtues have to be fostered, even though the political regime, that's not the end of the political regime. It's a means for sustaining the political regime. So, to give you an example that a colleague of mine, Thomas West, pointed out to me, when you had the American Revolution and you had it shift from colonial status to states, there was a change in the law of marriage. divorce became easier, and marriage was no longer looked on as a sacrament by the political community. That is to say, by the state of Virginia or the state of New York or whatever. But there was punishment for adultery,
Mhm.
rather severe punishment for adultery. And there was severe punishment for out of wedlock births. Because where adultery is common, you're going to have violence. You're going to have disorder. You're going to have terrible jealousy. And
Right.
it's going to impinge on the capacity of the political community to protect people's lives, their liberties, and their property. Similarly, with out of wedlock births, you don't have the proper rearing of the young.
Right. Right.
And in the absence of the proper rearing of the young, as we can see every day in today's America,
Yes. Yes.
there's going to be a tremendous amount of disorder.
Right.
So if you look at the law codes of the nascent American states, they were severe not for the purposes of piety, but for the purposes of instilling the limited kind of virtue that's absolutely necessary within a commercial republic. You've got to keep your contracts, you've got to be orderly, you can't be drunk and disorderly, you can't be seducing other men's wives. You can just go down a list of things. And they were really tough on all of these things. So the very fact of politics means that a species of civic virtue, maybe not an obsession with the greatness of your political community, but a species of civic virtue and a species of public spiritedness is necessary. I mean, one thing I sometimes do is I have people read Pericles' funeral oration, which is a wonderful piece. Um, and it is obsessively political. It's very moving. But at a certain point, he says, you look upon the beauty of your city and become her erostai, lovers. In this case, the language is hetero, is homosexual. Um, be obsessed with the greatness of your city uh, the way you would be obsessed with someone if you fell in love with them.
Uh,
Um,
yeah.
that's extreme. And if you think about it, eros is aimed at the beautiful. So you're obsessed with your city because it's beautiful. And I've always thought that when Pericles delivered this speech, the Parthenon must have been in the background. It was built in his time, and the speech was given outside, so he could very well have been speaking to people in front of him, and behind him is looming the Acropolis with the Parthenon on the Acropolis. But what he has mainly in mind is conquest. So, if you're looking at Athens, sometimes people say, well, Athens is very commercial. And in one sense, it was. In the Piraeus, there was a great deal of commerce. But what made Athens tick was tribute. So the kind of economy practiced was martial. You dominate other peoples and you protect them.
Right.
But in return, they have to provide tribute. And that tribute enables your citizens to live tolerably well. In the case of commerce, you don't do that. The notion is there's a mutual benefit from the trade. And the kind of obsession with the political, the glorification of domination, does not go well with Christianity. Whether you're Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox or Coptic or whatever. And it also doesn't go very well with the modern liberal republic, which looks to commerce rather than war for enrichment. So there's a very negative thing about the ancient city. Now there's something admirable too. And look, if you wander about America and you look at public architecture, until very recently, public architecture was neoclassical. Um, it looked a little bit like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello.
Mm.
Our capital, the very word capital points to Rome. Our capital is neoclassical in character. The White House is neoclassical in character. The Supreme Court building is neoclassical in character.
Didn't these architects also, like when Greek kind of turned into Rome, and Rome took a lot of ideas and architecture from Greek, and then that
Oh, yes.
stood the test of time into even our culture here. So it's like we still have a lot of ancient Greek here. We just don't really think about it.
No, but if you start to think about it and then look around you, you see it
Right.
every post
Yeah.
offices, from the New Deal period are very often of that sort. And there's a reason for it. The founding generation looked back to classical antiquity uh, as something admirable uh, that they were going to surpass.
Mhm.
So I don't think you can read the Federalist and understand the arguments about the American Constitution unless you paid some attention to Athens, Sparta, and Rome.
Mhm.
Because when you read it, there are references to Athens, Sparta, and Rome. And what is clear is that they admire the ancient achievement of self government, which in and of itself is noble and admirable.
Right.
And they think they can do better. They can do, they look at Athens losing the Peloponnesian War, falling prey to the Macedonians. They look at Sparta winning in the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, and then being a disaster in the aftermath, and ending up as a kind of Disneyland at the bottom of the Balkans. They look at Rome, and it eventuates in emperors, monsters, some of them, Nero and Domitian and so forth. And so the question they're asking themselves is, can we do better than this? And by the way, the English think in very similar terms. They think of their government as a kind of republican or a monarchical republic in which the House of Commons is extremely important, House of Lords is extremely important, and they think about Rome. And their question is, can we surpass them? And how do you surpass them? Well, you found something that lasts longer. That's one dimension of it, but that isn't dependent upon slavery.
Mm.
That substitutes commerce for war, so there isn't the cruelty of the sort that you had in ancient Rome
Right.
and the Athenians and so forth. Uh, that's more stable and more just.
Right.
Um, and the thought is that if you depoliticize to a certain degree through a democracy that is representative rather than direct, and if you have a separation of powers, and if you have the advantage of being on a continent isolated from all the troubles of Europe, uh, you may be able to found a republic that is longer lived than the Roman Republic, more just than the Roman Republic, and think technology, more prosperous than the
Right.
Roman Republic.
Right.
Um, so, if you're thinking about schools, and I know you're thinking about schools because
Yeah.
that's education is your focus, an awareness of this on the part of high school students in particular, though you can prepare the way by looking at neoclassical architecture and by doing a bit of reading in the ancient historians earlier than that.
Uh-huh.
If you emphasize this, then you can situate the American Republic in a history of republicanism. You can show the manner in which the ancient republics were impressive but failed. And you can talk about the attempt in Britain and the more forthright attempt in North America to surpass what the ancients had achieved.
Are any of these failures in America now that you see relate to some of the failures back in the ancient, like the Rome and the ancient
Yes,
Greece?
I mean, look, the fundamental problem of the ancient city, be it a Greek city or be it Rome, is faction.
Mhm.
The fundamental problem is the propensity of human beings to be partisan, to
Yeah.
take part, to um, uh, and that's visible in ancient Rome. It's visible in Athens. It's visible in Sparta.
Mhm.
And in the case of Rome and Athens in particular, it was arguably fatal to them. So, for example, we hear about lawfare today, and there are those in our American law schools who teach lawfare. That is to say, conducting war under the color of law.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's exactly what some people think is absolutely necessary. Well, that sort of thing did happen in Athens and in Rome. I'll give you an Athenian example. There was a propensity as politics heated up in Athens after the death of Pericles to treat generals who failed in the field as traitors. And so generals get tried if something goes wrong on their while they're in office. Now, it's perfectly understandable that you might cashier them or not reelect them, uh, but there were trials,
Mhm.
and these were it was treated as a capital crime. So people were driven into exile, uh, or they were tortured, and there was a fair amount of this. Um, the effect it had on Athenian generals was they couldn't retreat. They couldn't be seen to have failed. So the consequence is they took risks that they should never have taken. Instead of acknowledging that their attempt to take Syracusa in the period from 415 to 413 um, had failed, that they weren't going to succeed, Nicias and then others who join him as generals, a man named Demosthenes, they stay on making last bid attempts to take Syracusa. Where they could have withdrawn with their forces more or less intact, there would have been losses, but not severe. They lost everything. They lost two major fleets and most of the people rowing in them. They lost thousands of hoplites, and they made Athens vulnerable to Sparta.
And that
Uh,
was due because of the pressures that they're going to have with their authorities. I mean, if it was up to them and there was no consequence for it, do you think they would have rethink things and
Absolutely. They openly, I mean, according to Thucydides, who reports on their conversations, they openly discuss this question. And Nicias said, I would rather die here at the hands of the Syracusans than be tortured to death by my compatriots.
uh,
So,
interesting? Yeah.
so it once lawfare begins, once domestic politics becomes a matter of war under the guise of law and under the guise of politics, people begin to calculate differently.
Uh,
And I'll give you another example. In the last years of the war, after the Sicilian expedition, there Athens at one point found itself in desperate circumstances because the Persians were funding Spartan fleets. If Sparta lost a fleet, they could build a new one. And Athens, because of their losses in Sicily, were short of resources.
hmm.
At a desperate moment, they send out a fleet to the vicinity of the island of Lesbos, to a place called Arganusai, um, to relieve a siege in which there are 50 Athenian ships and their crews that would be captured if the siege succeeded. And they're absolutely desperate. They put every tub that will float into the water, and they man them almost entirely with their own citizens. Fairly often, previously, they'd had the money to hire rowers from all over the Aegean. But here, they don't have any money. So they've got to put citizens in these boats, including many people who'd never rowed before. They win this battle. It's a kind of miracle, and it's a consequence of good generalship. They arranged their forces so that their defects did not harm them, and they caused the other side to take risks they shouldn't have taken, just the way the fleet was deployed. In the aftermath, they were going to send about half of their ships to pick up the survivors, those who had been on ships that had sunk, and the bodies of the dead. And it's very important in the Greek world that you bury the dead. And the other half was to go to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos to relieve the siege. A storm came up, and neither part of there are two parts of this fleet, was able to go. Because in storms, these triremes, which lie low in the water, are in grave danger. The consequence is the people who had been floating about, the survivors, drowned, and the bodies were sunk and then popped up a few days later about 10 to 20 miles south of there. So they couldn't bury them. They couldn't find them to bury them. When they get back home, there's a kind of religious hysteria at Athens, and the Athenians execute the victorious generals. I can't think of any time in human history where a population has done anything as stupid as that. These people have pulled off a miracle. And it wasn't their fault that they didn't pick up the survivors or find the bodies of the dead for burial. But there was a kind of religious hysteria at Athens, and they executed them. And then they send out the B team of generals who lose at Aegospotami, and they lose the war. Now, I mention all of this because it has to do with a kind of heightened rivalry. That's what lay behind the attempt to get these generals. They were very popular. And there were other people envious and jealous, and they wanted to bring them down. Now, we've always had this in our politics. There's always been rivalry. There's always been kind of fierce competition at election time, but lawfare is something new. And it's rather like what happened in Athens. It raises the stakes. You lose not just the election, not just your office. You lose your life, your family loses their property. It's a total disaster. And we're seeing something similar. We have not had executions yet, though we've had assassination attempts.
Right.
In our own politics. And now, if you look at the late Roman Republic, you get the same thing. One of the reasons Caesar crosses the Rubicon is that if he had come home on the terms, the appropriate terms requested by the Senate, he knew he was going to go on trial, and he knew that the jury would be fixed. That is to say that his political enemies would use the legal system against him, and that they were in a position to pull it off. So where the Rubicon is a boundary, if you cross the Rubicon with an army, it's war. You're supposed to leave your army on the other side of the Rubicon and return peacefully to the city. Well, he crosses the Rubicon with an army because he's up against it. And this is the ultimate endpoint of a process that's gone on for almost 100 years at that stage, in which people have been prosecuted, in some cases, for doing noble things. So when the competition that is natural to a republic gets out of hand in this way, terrible things can happen.
Hmm.
And, I think what happened in Athens, what happened in Rome is a warning to us. And the people who teach lawfare in American law schools ought to be expelled from their jobs.
Really? Thanks.
In other words, our system depends upon impartiality in judges and really on impartiality in prosecutors. They have great power to ruin people. Even if they don't get a conviction, they ruin people because of the cost of defending yourself.
Right.
So the process is the punishment. And for law schools to teach people how to do this is to suggest what we need is a civil war. And people who foment civil war by teaching what they teach in the law schools should lose their jobs.
That's scary.
And that you can learn by looking ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
It's not. I just read today that evidently, and I know it's not the West, but South Korea just announced martial law that the leaders had just instigated, and it's mostly due to they in their mind is that they didn't want the competition to rise up against what they had, because that would be he used those own words with that, but there would be a conflict to the democracy that they have. So they have martial law now. And it just reminded me from what this conversation is that it escalates too much. We got to figure out, well, what's the answer then? If these things are going to come about, is it too late? How do you take a U-turn from it?
But look, the other thing that you can learn from looking at the ancient republics is when you get moral corruption, widespread adultery, for example, there are consequences of that too. And we're in a situation where there are a substantial number of people who preach polyamory. And there's a kind of general assault on the integrity of the family. It begins with no-fault divorce. Think about it in these terms. Can you think of a contract that you can break and there's no punishment?
That's a good question.
I can. It's called marriage.
Yeah.
And that was once not true. And it was good for the country that it was not true. Look, I live in Hillsdale County, Michigan. We have more children born out of wedlock than in wedlock.
Really?
In Hillsdale County. It's the poorest county in the state. It's almost entirely white. And the family breakdown, we sometimes hear of family breakdown among African Americans. Well, there's family breakdown among people who aren't African Americans.
Yeah.
On a considerable scale. And if you look at the homeless crisis that we face, there's a relationship between family breakdown and personal breakdown, kind of thing that leaves people sort of incapable of functioning as citizens, as fathers, mothers, as providers. And then if you throw the legalization of marijuana into it, the marijuana that is available today is very different from the marijuana that was available when I started college in 1967. It's about 10 times as strong.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
Yeah, and the marijuana of my time in college produced a fair number of people who never really worked very hard. It a sort
Imagine
of
that.
laid back life. Um,
Yeah.
this is more extreme, and there's a direct connection between drugs uh, and the rise. There were always homeless, but the numbers are huge now. So people have to honor their contracts. They have to pay their bills.
Mhm.
Uh, they they um, uh, they have to be orderly. They have to be focused. They have to work hard. That's what makes the system work, and that's a species uh, of civic virtue.
That reminds
My
me,
my sense is it's very hard to be a school teacher today, especially in the public schools,
yeah,
because the problems that are nourished in the home are brought into the schoolroom. And teachers and schools are not equipped to substitute for parents.
right. Absolutely.
And I don't see how they could be equipped. I mean, maybe you need orphanages for non-orphans,
Right.
because the old orphanages did a pretty good job. But what you have now is trying to keep order in the classroom is a challenge.
Yeah,
And you need order in the classroom before you can teach anybody anything.
exactly. Exactly.
So,
Yeah. And I've been a teacher for a long time. I mean, most of my experience is with college, so I didn't really have too much of that, but I have been in the high schools and public school here, and even private schools. And yeah, the behavior problems, the disorderly conduct, it's impossible. It can't be done. Even if it's just one student, it's all it
yes,
takes. It's
yes,
all
it
it takes
takes
is one.
very little to disrupt a classroom.
Right. And it is impossible. And it's a lot of times the teachers get blamed for not having classroom management, and it's just, it's a tough, after a while, you have to set down the iron fist to everybody, not just the students, the parents, the administration, the society in
Right,
general, everybody to come together and say, hey, this is the issue. We're not at fault here. Okay.
right. It's so look, you cannot have a successful republic of drug addicts,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because uh, the drug addict's first obligation is to the drug, not to his family, not to his parents, not to his fellow citizens,
Yeah.
and he'll do anything for the fix. And he won't do the things of a positive sort that need doing. So when this is widespread, the society can no longer function.
Right.
And this is virtue on a much more uh, plain schedule, plain level, on a lower level than what was expected in the ancient Greek city, where every citizen was a soldier, uh, and where you depended on the people next to you in the battle line for your own survival. So the demands, the demands for a certain kind of excellence within the ancient community were far greater than the demands that the United States generally has imposed upon people. We have
Mm-hmm.
soldiers too, and sometimes we've had large wars with large numbers of people called up. And when that happens, uh, rhetorically, we turn to the classics. So Pericles' funeral oration suddenly gets a kind of leverage over the public that it ordinarily doesn't have. Um, but but there is a kind of virtue. I'll call it bourgeois virtue. It's the virtue of the law-abiding middle class. They don't get divorced. They rear their children with some care. They are perfect. Um, Maybe they drank too much last Saturday night, but uh, they don't disturb the society, and they don't inflict on the society young people who are totally out of control.
Right. Right.
And they show up at work on Monday morning and do a real day's work. Or they manage a household in such a way that it's not, shabby.
Selfless, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and those virtues are terribly important.
Mhm.
Further, a kind of impartiality is important. Um, the you don't make excuses for scoundrels who happen to belong to the political party that you ordinarily vote for.
Mhm.
Uh, and your attitude should be, we need to clean up our act. And we had that to a considerable degree. I don't mean that there weren't sort of mad partisans in the past, but it wasn't as common as it is now.
Mhm.
Uh, the Now the other side uh, of the sort of legacy of Greece that we haven't talked about um, is an appreciation for the beautiful and the noble in sculpture, in painting, in poetry, in history, and in philosophy. Um, I've taught this now. This is my 50th year in the classroom, so I've been doing this
Oh,
for a very long time. And
congratulations.
yeah, 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 just means I'm old. The um, uh, there's a great joy in teaching Plato's Symposium. Uh, and it begins as a kind of sad discussion of eros in a sort of homoerotic sort. And then it becomes something else, which is to say, the question is raised, what is it that you love when you love? And you get a notion that, I mean, if you Christianize it, what you would say is what you see in the other person is the image of God. And the Christian way of sort of stealing Plato's Symposium from the pagan Greeks uh, was to suggest that eros is, in fact, the desire for the kind of wholeness we had when we were in paradise. Uh, the Greek version of that is that it, it's a love for the beautiful and the good in and of themselves. Um, uh, and it makes sense of eros. That is to say, uh, that kind of desire is aimed at what we admire. And what do we admire? We admire the beautiful, the noble, the
Right.
fine. In other words, what are you attracted to? What gets you excited? And the answer is not the crass, not the vulgar, not the ugly, um, but that which is impressive and beautiful and admirable. Admirable comes from a word meaning striking wonder. That which strikes wonder in us. Uh, One of the things I say to my students is, once upon a time when I was teaching at the University of Tulsa, I was taken to a football game, and we had the worst tickets in the stadium, behind the goalposts, way up high. Um, but there was an onside kick and a return. And the guy ran the whole field, breaking tackles at every turn. And
Mhm.
I was in the catbird seat to watch this because it's coming right at me. Um, and it was like watching ballet. It took your breath away. Okay, that's what Eros is about. It's about that which takes your breath away. And the sexual dimension of it is only one dimension of it, and maybe not the most important dimension of it. And that's something you can learn from reading Plato's Symposium. Or you can, in reading Plato's Republic, you can get a sense of, um, well, one thing you can get a sense of is utopian expectations are really mad and they lead to something monstrous. In other words, the actual city that Plato and Glaucon and Adeimantus are imagining in speech is more and more impossible. What are the preconditions for having a fully just society? Well, no private property.
Seems like
Uh,
individualism wasn't an option either.
yeah, no families. Sexual communism. You don't know who your children are because if you do know who your children are, guess what? You're going to prefer them to other people's children.
Right, right,
And if you
right.
don't believe me, go to a little league game and watch the parents. Don't watch the game.
Ah,
Watch the conduct of the parents. This is like a psychologist going to a porn film and watching the people in the audience.
right.
it's it's it's
Yeah, it's
but
pretty.
it's very striking. We love our own
Mhm.
more than we love that which is good and
Sure.
beautiful. And thank God we do, because society would be impossible if we didn't love our own.
Right, right.
Uh, so, in raising the question of justice, Socrates keeps pushing to the point where there is no my own. There's
Mhm.
no my own property. There's no my own children. Um, uh, and you realize that perhaps you should be sober in your pursuit of justice. You need to leave a little space for the love of one's own.
There you go. Yeah,
Um, because civilization somehow is not based on perfect justice. And certainly my preferring my own children to your children is not perfect justice. Um, I'll tell you they're better than your children, but I'm lying,
right,
uh, at least a good bit of the part of the time. Uh, it's absolutely necessary for rearing children that they be loved
right. Absolutely.
and they be preferred.
And that's why parents need to be involved with the education as much as anything else. Now they have to.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
And
My
that's
wife, uh, we have four children. At the age of 3, she started trying to teach them to read. She would read
okay.
to them and then she'd make them sound things out. And it was like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. No progress. Uh, and when they were 4, suddenly they could read.
Ah,
Everything she had fed them, they possessed it. And there was a brain change when they were 4, and they had all this material to work with. It was just there. And so literally they could whip off a sentence to you.
so it takes time to
Just
connect
suddenly
it. Right,
it
right,
happens.
right,
Yeah. And um, that's why the role played by parents in education is at least as important
Mhm.
as the role played by schools.
And that's why I make it a point to the parents or the families that I'll be meeting is it. I don't just want their participation because I'm transparent. Obviously, I want to be very transparent, and I hope that would be a good reputation. But it's more because what you just said, really. If you want parent or if you want our students to really be nurtured and engaged, especially in something as important as education, then everybody's got to be behind the child's back, not just the teacher when it comes to academics. So and that's how they're going to grow intellectually, morally, with virtue. Just a teacher's just not going to do it. I'm not trying to undermine our profession, but the parents have got to be there if you want the whole entire
we come
package.
along later and take advantage of what the parents did.
Right, right.
And our ability to take a child from where they are when we meet them to another level
Mhm.
depends on them having reached a certain level before they reach us.
Right.
And it's but now the other thing is Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle's just wonderful. It's not a book I would present to junior high or grade school. or even to freshmen and sophomores, but juniors and seniors can appreciate it. The Nicomachean Ethics is a wonderful book. It's not as exciting as Plato's Republic. It's not a drama.
Right.
It's not as exciting as the as the symposium. I mean, Eros is an exciting subject, especially for 17 and 18-year-olds. But it does raise all the questions about how you should live your life. And one of the things that's striking about it is Aristotle devotes two of the books in the Nicomachean Ethics to friendship. Now, if you think about it, in modern philosophy, friendship plays almost no role. Hobbes doesn't discuss it, Locke doesn't discuss it, Hume doesn't discuss it, Kant doesn't discuss it. It's the modern understanding of human beings emphasizes their disconnectedness, the state of nature, war of all against all, and so forth, and the fact that their connectedness is artificial through the founding of a political community, which is understood as an artifact. Ancient political thought seems to me to be closer to the truth in that friendship is terribly important to everyone. And if you want young people to reflect on friendship, to bring to full consciousness how they're living their lives,
Right.
And how they might better live their lives, there's nothing like those books on friendship. So there's a kind of teaching about what a good life would look like. You find it also in some of the writings of Cicero, De Officiis on obligations, or he has a dialogue on De Amicitia on friendship.
Mm.
And what he has to say is rather similar to what you find in Aristotle, but it's very nicely done in Aristotle. And then if you turn to the politics, then the question is, are we really political animals? And that would mean that we're not fully human unless somehow we are participants in a political community, that there are, we'd be like a stunted oak tree that didn't quite grow to the height that it could grow because we lived in a tyranny and we had no say, no input, no public spiritedness because you don't care about what you have no stake in, no involvement in.
Right. Right.
Uh, and I think there's an awful lot to be said for Aristotle's vision of this. One of the things he says is the polis, the political community, comes into being for the sake of mere life. That's Hobbes. Then he says it remains in being for the sake of the good life. And I think his point is we have a tendency to enter the political arena because we have a grievance, because of our own material well-being, the material well-being of our children.
It's a very interesting point. Yeah, I never thought about that.
But once we get into it,
Mm-hmm.
we begin to interest ourselves in the well-being of other people.
Right.
Public spiritedness grows out of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you deny people the experience, there's going to be very little public spiritedness.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of every man for himself, or more likely every family for itself. And there are parts of the world where it looks like that. There are parts of the world where you cannot have a public corporation because the employees will loot it. There's no ethics.
Right.
I work for the company, they pay me a salary, I go home, I don't cheat. And those parts of the world are parts of the world in which the only unit that is really viable is the family. And this has historically been true in China. It's pretty much true in the Arab world, which is why political freedom is almost non-existent in the Arab world. Uh, and why when you get a group that comes to power, what do? They enrich their cousins and their
right,
and, yeah, I mean
right,
it's yeah, a government is just pure patronage would be another way of putting it. Um, but in a kind of place where something like the New England town meeting exists, you may go to the town meeting because you're ticked off about something. Somebody's
right,
pigs are, eating in your garden. But suddenly you're dealing with things that involve the community as a whole, and you become aware of the common good. This is an argument that Aristotle makes. You'll find it in Tocqueville too, because he comes to America and he looks at the American democracy and the way it works, and that's what he sees. People go into politics generally because they've got some sort of personal concern or family concern or material concern.
right,
And the next thing is they're thinking about what can we do as a community together that would be good for the community.
right, right.
Um, so again, this
Yeah.
comes alive if you study antiquity more than if you study um, contemporary political science.
Well, that brings me to a question that I wanted to ask before, because it looks like we're running a little bit out of time here. But I wanted to get this question out. Is my curriculum is essentially classical education, and I didn't come up with this curriculum. It's been around for 2,500 years. Uh,
Yes.
I'd love to take credit for something this great, but it wasn't me. All I want to do is revive it and put it back. And there just seems like there was a time in our public schools that they had that. And then somewhere down the line, I don't know when, but it just faded out. And so my question is, if we put classical education in the schools again, what kind of improvements do you think we could see, not just in the students, but maybe in society as a whole, decades down the road?
Well, I would require Latin of everyone.
Oh, okay.
And I would combine Latin with the teaching of Roman history. And it's
Oh,
easy to do because you just sort of work it in.
right.
Uh, uh, and that was done. I
Mhm.
mean, Northwest class in high school in Oklahoma City, that's exactly what I got from Janie Creekmore, whom I remember with great fondness. It, it uh, Here's what you can get from Latin: grammar.
Ah,
It improves
yeah.
writing in English. Uh,
Mhm.
it makes people actually reflect on language and how sentences are put together in ways that increasingly students who come to college have not done. As I said, I've been teaching college for 50 years, and the quality of the writing has gone down universally.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's
Uh,
that's a good point. It's like it's whenever you make something that great and that beneficial obsolete, which Latin, I mean,
yeah,
unfortunately, it's obsolete language. Unfortunately, I don't know why, but it became obsolete. But look what happened because of that. The consequence of that, the reading levels declined, the
yep.
writing levels are in America.
And then the capacity to think about politics.
Yeah.
If in the course of taking Latin, you are also learning the history of Roman politics,
Mhm.
you can talk impartially about the Romans more easily than you can talk impartially about yourself and your own world.
Mm.
And that itself is an education. So reading Cicero, wonderful. Reading the Aeneid, uh, and learning about the relationship between religion and politics in antiquity, uh, it, it, it allows one to think, well, we're not quite like that. Why aren't we quite like that?
Right.
So you can look. All thinking is comparative. So if you live in a particular society and you know nothing of other societies, especially other societies that are quite different,
Right.
you won't know your own society. You really won't, because you will take things for granted. You will not reflect on things that you need to reflect on. That, why do we do this way? They didn't do that. There must be some logic to it. Questions come up. Questions don't come up um, if you're not familiar with another civilization. And the problem is, if your purview is limited to the contemporary world, an awful lot of the world looks just like us. They watch the same movies. They wear the same
Right.
fashions. I mean, there are considerable differences. A visit to Saudi Arabia for 3 months would be very enlightening for people.
Right.
I suspect a visit to China would be very enlightening to people. And you can surely learn something from going to countries in Europe or going to Japan or going to Australia and New Zealand.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think you'd learn more if you went to 18th century France, and we could do it in our imaginations,
Mhm.
or if you went to England during the English Civil War, or you go to ancient Greece or Rome. I've taught all of these things, so
You
I've
taught
seen
Latin too?
the effect. Um, uh, and what it makes people is better informed as citizens.
Yeah. That's what's important.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible what people will vote for now, and they don't know anything about the policies. They just don't like the way someone wears their hair. So,
Yes,
and
yes,
it
yes,
just
yes.
gets ridiculous. It gets to a point. Is this person canceling out my vote? And it's like at some point you have to step back. Professor, it looks like we're out of time, but I'll tell you what, I mean, your insights are just fascinating. I
Thank
know,
you very much. It was a
I,
pleasure being with you.
yeah, and I know the students and families are going to love to hear this. And it's a 3 volume, but it's certainly worth it. And we'll figure out a way to get all that info in there somehow.
Okay, good.
So,
By
but
the
yeah,
way, in the last few years, I've done 6 volumes on Spartan grand strategy. I've
ah,
been writing about the conduct of foreign policy in war. And you might glance at those too, because they're
oh yeah,
fun.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
I got a long way to go when it comes to catching up because there's so much to unpack. In the
Yeah.
work that you do, it's like you don't want to just skim through it and read it like it's a novel. You really got to look and extract information. If it takes longer, then so be it. But yeah,
Well,
so
the last of these volumes was published 3 weeks ago. It's
ah,
called Sparta's Third Attic War. It's about
Spartus.
the end of the Peloponnesian War. It's
Okay,
fun to write.
you bet.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, thanks a lot, Professor. Bye bye.